Tristan Kumar's Dying Planet, The Season of Chaos. Narrated by Tristan Kumar. Part 29. Loose Ends. I watched as I fell away from the world above me. I looked around. I was falling through what seemed to be a very big black void. I watched as my armor slowly ejected itself into the disc without me telling it to. The disc started to fly upward, and I barely grabbed it just in time. I stuffed it into my pocket and turned around. Facing away from the light, I started to dive faster and faster. In front of me in the void were many small white flecks that looked like stars. In the darkness, I watched as slowly something formed. In rough handwriting, the words, November 5th, 2026, slowly started to appear in front of me in red. It looked like the spell was trying to figure out where to go. The words disappeared, and the words, Plasma's Inn, started to appear. I could remember the distinct times that me and my parents would always go to Plasma's Inn after a trip in the wilds of Colorado, but why that day? The white flecks started to become more and more clumped, and eventually it looked like snow. Suddenly, I landed on something soft. I was facing up toward the sky. I saw a lightning streak across the sky quickly. It was raining very heavily, and I was getting drenched. I slowly stood up and shivered. I was back at Plasma's Inn. I had already been here recently in my dream, but this time it looked much scarier. I looked around. There was a big parking lot, but only one car. I went to the navy blue car and looked into it. I recognized this car to be from my family. We must have been here. My eyes widened. Sylvie was going to kill my parents and me. I did the math, and at the time, I had just turned 7 only 6 days ago. She was going to kill a child. I had to stop her. Suddenly, I heard a faint bell sound in the distance. I looked at the entrance of Plasma's Inn and watched as someone in white just entered. Sylvie. I ran in the rain to the entrance and I burst inside. I shook the rain off my head to not trip up going the stairs. I jogged in and looked around. I suddenly fell to the ground in surprise. There was blood splattered across the wall in contrast to the yellow wall behind the reception desk. I stood up and gasped. I went behind the desk, but no one was there. I continued to walk in the direction of where I thought Sylvie went. I walked to the left and then turned the corner. I peeked around it, and no one was there. I continued and went around the corner and walked down the long hallway. The windows at the end of the hall struck white as lightning streaked across it, and thunder shook the building. I continued walking and finally reached room 101. The door was cracked open. I pushed open the door. I looked around. It was just like my dream. Messy. Unorganized. I turned the corner and looked at the bed. There was also junk on it, but this time there were some blood drops on the ground going to the bed. I walked closer and closer to the bed in anticipation, curious, but also fearing what was in the bundle of blankets where the blood led. I walked next to the bed and looked into the blankets. If I said that I knew every part of my story, I would be telling the truth. It's my life, after all. I saw what was in those blankets, but what I saw was terrifying. Even I, someone who had decimated entire planets and survived for so long, could not stand the sight of what I saw in that bed. I wish that I had never seen what was in those blankets. It was a mistake that I would soon learn meant so much more than I ever thought. So, after I saw what was in the blankets, I backed up against the wall. I tried to breathe deeply to calm me down, but my chest was so heavy in fear. What had I just seen? It was terrible. Suddenly, the door opened around the corner. I snuck to the closet and opened the door quietly. I snuck inside and closed it. I watched through the crack of the door as someone walked into the bedroom. This figure had a white hood on with a white bandana over his mouth and nose. They had white robes, but no sleeves on their arm. This person was like an angel. They walked to the bed and looked in the blankets. They winced in fear and pain. They reached down and picked up the blankets with the thing in them and walked out of the bedroom. I heard them close the door once they exited the room, and I got ready to leave and follow. Suddenly, I heard breathing behind me. I slowly turned around, and the closet seemed much bigger and darker than before. In the back of the bigger room, there was a child-sized figure against the wall. They had red eyes and were shaking rapidly. I recognized this person from my dreams in the prison of the survivors before everything went to hell. I was never sure who this figure was. I could hear them softly crying, and I tried to move toward them. Suddenly, I heard the voice of General Rogers saying, "Stay focused." Surprised, I looked away trying to find his voice, but I couldn't find anything. He was only in my head. When I looked back to the figure slumped against the wall, they were gone, and it was back to being a regular small closet. At that moment, I realized that I was supposed to be following the figure in white, so I quickly opened the closet doors and got out. I looked in the bed again. The only thing left in the place where the blankets were was a large blood stain. I walked out of the room disgusted and immediately ran into Sylvie in the hall. She was wearing a white shirt and black pants, like me. She scowled at me and threw a punch at me, and I got hit in the nose. I flew back into the room. "Stop trying to protect him," she yelled at me. "I don't know what you mean," I yelled back on the floor. I was, of course, lying. I stood up and she threw another punch at me. I dodged it and put both my hands on her back. I shoved her into the room and she fell to the ground. She faced me as I walked into the hallway. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said. She started to get up, so I closed the door. I reached behind a tall stand for items across the door and forced them down into the door. Sylvie opened the door and was immediately forced back into the room with various items on her. She snorted in anger as I peeked around the corner. I saw a figure in white enter the reception desk. I looked back at Sylvie. I figured that she would be trapped there for a while, so I went around the corner to follow the figure in white. As I came down the hallway to the reception desk, I heard the sound of rock sliding onto the ground. Once I made it to the corner, I saw the figure in white walk down a secret staircase surrounded by stone behind the reception desk. I waited for a while after the figure went down and eventually turned the corner and went down the stairwell too. I saw the figure in the white far down underground, so I had to follow him. The staircase was cold and unnerving. It felt like I was heading to a medieval dungeon. I thought of many times when I should turn back, but I knew that I had to get to the bottom of the mystery and what I found in the blankets. Suddenly, I stopped walking down the stairs and started walking on flat ground. I had been walking for so long that I was already here. I looked up the stairwell. We were a long way down. I continued down the narrow, well-lit stone hallway. Eventually, it opened to a massive room, but this was not what I expected at all. The massive room was a laboratory. There were many different types of equipment like tables, microscopes, and other more technologically advanced equipment at that time. The thing that I noticed first was a giant air chamber in the lab. I watched as the figure in white walked into the massive air chamber and set the blankets down on a table in the middle. The figure walked out and took off its hood and mask. It was a middle-aged man with a small goatee. He reached into his pocket and put on his glasses. Now, he looked even more familiar. I watched as the man said, "You can come out now." He had a soft, young voice. From a table on the other side of the lab, another figure in white stood up from under the table. "Hopefully this works. If it doesn't, then all of this has been for nothing," they said as they pulled off their hood and mask. It was a woman with long black hair and a nice face. The man went to the woman and kissed her on the forehead. He said softly, "I hope it works too." They both closed their eyes, and eventually the woman said, "All right, let's do it." The man nodded, and they separated from each other. They went to the table facing the air chamber. They pushed some buttons on the keyboard on the table, and the air chamber started to power up. The man typed some more buttons while the woman prepared to push the lever forward. It seemed like the two of them were a really good team. Eventually, the machine was ready, so the man watched the woman. Her hand was shaking while holding the lever. He walked over to her quickly and put his hand on hers. "I'm scared," she said as she looked at the man. "I am too," he said. "But we can't let that evil man tell us what to do." I looked at them confused. "Baranova will pay," the woman said. "They all will," the man said. My eyes widened. I finally realized what had happened to the thing in the blankets. "We can't tell him about it, though," the woman said. "He won't have to fight if we win this," the man assured. They looked at each other longingly again and kissed each other on the lips. Once they finished, they both pushed the lever forward. The light started to flicker and the room shook. The man and the woman grabbed each other as the room began to shake more intensely. The blankets started to rise from the table in the air chamber as I watched the blankets move away, unveiling the thing that I had been hiding this entire time. When I said that I didn't want to unveil what was in the blankets, that didn't mean the blanket didn't unveil itself, showing the thing in the blanket to all of us. It did, and the thing in the blanket was not a thing at all. The thing was a person, a child to be more exact. This was a younger version of myself, most likely killed by Baranova in this very inn. I'm not sure why I couldn't even remember dying before, but it all came to me now. I understood what these two scientists were doing. They were saving my life. Suddenly, red energy started to crackle around the young child in the air chamber. He was lifted off the ground as the wind swirled around him. Then, it stopped. I watched as the boy fell to the ground quickly, and the two scientists ran inside the air chamber, desperate for results. The man checked the child's pulse and smiled at the woman. She jumped into his arms, and they both cried tears of joy. They both bent over and cried over the child. He was alive. At that moment, I realized why the people were crying so hard. This was their son, and the two people that had saved me were my own parents. I realized this and tried to get one last look at my parents. This was the first time I was seeing my parents in 7 years. It's been so long. I stood up and tried to run to them. Suddenly, I was kicked in the back by someone behind me. I turned around. It was Sylvie. She somehow had a gun this time. There were many cuts all over her body from trying to escape from the items that had fallen on her. She pointed the gun at me, but suddenly looked at my parents in the air chamber with the 8-year-old version of me. She smiled and pointed the gun at them instead. "No!" I yelled. I jumped at her and tackled her to the ground. Instead of hitting the ground, we both started to fall back into the void. Before we completely fell into the void, I watched as my parents looked at me, or where I was, in confusion. They were shocked. Did they see me? Did they recognize me? I couldn't tell because we dropped into the void. Distracted, Sylvie kicked me in the chest, making me let her go. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another paper. She wrote something on it while we flew into the void, and the words in red ink slowly started to appear in the black sky above. December 10th, 2029. I gasped. That was the day my parents died. How did she know about these things? I dived toward her and grabbed the paper, but the only thing I grabbed was one side of the already ripped paper. I was done giving mercy to her. I threw a punch at her in midair, but we both disappeared right in time to my next nightmare. I fell onto the smooth ground. I groaned in pain. I had broken something in my back. Either way, I had already done it before, so I was used to it. It still really hurt. I was facing the plain ceiling, although it was very high up still. It felt like I was in a very luxurious building. I stood up and looked around. It was in a large, empty room with massive window on one side of the walls. It was very dark outside. Midnight, almost. I walked to the window and looked out. I was back in Las Vegas, but a less advanced version of the one that I knew. I realized that we were in the Bellagio. I heard some people talking behind me. They got closer to the door, so I looked around to find a place to hide. I found a janitor's closet heading out of the big room and ran to it. I swung open the door and jumped inside, and the people walked in the room. So, this is what the plan is. We're going to create this red cube and spread it across the globe. It will be the best commercial product that we've ever invented, a man said. He had a lab coat with glasses on. He was following behind a man with leather jacket on and some dark shades. I see what you mean, the man in the leather jacket said with a Russian accent. But what if it doesn't work? Trust me, it will, the man in the lab coat said. I watched intently as the man in the leather jacket took off his shades and looked at the man in the lab coat. The man in the leather jacket walked right up to the man and said, Listen, I'm sorry about your son. It was only business. It's not personal. We had to focus on the bigger pictures, you know? Yeah, I know. It was a distraction. We need to focus on the bigger pictures. The man in the lab coat finished as he watched the man in the leather jacket turn back around. The man in leather pulled a cigarette out of his pocket and pulled out a lighter as well. He lit it and puffed some smoke into the air. He coughed and wheezed. I finally recognized that man in the leather jacket was no other than Yuri Alexander Baranova himself. I think you need to understand the bigger picture, the man in the lab coat said angrily. What are you talking? Baranova said as he turned around to face the man in the lab coat holding a gun at him. I jumped in fear as the man in the lab coat shot Baranova violently. He fell back to the ground. The bigger picture is trying to raise a family, the man in the lab coat said as he took off his coat and threw it onto the ground. He was wearing a full black suit like the one I had worn when I was giving my Las Vegas presentation 3 years ago. He seemed like a completely different person now. What the Baranova started as he held his wound, which was pouring out blood. The man in the suit didn't hesitate and shot him in the head again. Baranova's blood leaked onto the clean floor as he lay dead on the ground. I watched as another woman in a black dress walked into the room. You okay? She asked the man in the suit. Like the weight of our son has been lifted off us. Now, he can live a better life with no problems, the man dreamed. It finally reached me that they were talking about me again. I couldn't quite recognize them because they looked like spy accomplices instead of my parents. I smiled as I watched my mom and my dad hug each other. It's going to be all right, my dad said to my mom. I know. He'll be just fine, my mom said. Suddenly, I watched Sylvie as she walked into the room. She grasped onto the gun that she had found very tightly and prepared to shoot my parents. I couldn't watch anymore, and I burst out of the closet. I heard my dad and my mom curse in shock and confusion, but I stepped in the way of my parents and Sylvie, already pointing the gun at my parents. "Who are you?" my dad asked me. "Hold on, Dad," I said, as I kept my eye on Sylvie. "Dad?" my mom and my dad questioned at the same time. I ignored them and tried to save them. "Stop, Sylvie, please don't do this. It's already too late," I begged Sylvie. "I'm done listening to your stupid complaints," Sylvie yelled at me. She grabbed onto the gun with her other hand and shot at me. "Move!" I yelled to my parents. My parents stopped holding each other and dived out of the way. I stepped to the side and looked back at Sylvie. "Stop, please, Sylvie, stop. I've never been with my parents for any time in my life that I can remember, and you just want to take them away to kill me? Please, my other self isn't here. This is my true self. I just want them," I yelled in tears at Sylvie. "You think that you haven't had enough time with your parents? Then look at me! I haven't even had real parents for more than 9 years," she said angrily, also crying. She clenched the gun, about to fire. "Son," my dad said behind me. I looked behind me. My dad was holding his gun out for me. I smiled at him and grabbed it. "So, what should we call you?" he said. "Call me Rye," I said, as I turned away from him and raised my gun towards Sylvie. Filled with anger, Sylvie shot at me. I jumped out of the way as she continued firing at me. I shot at her, and I eventually hit her in the shoulder. Her white shirt started to turn red with blood. I slowly made my way over to her and eventually got close enough to her, so flipped my gun in my hands and grabbed the front of it. I slammed it down on Sylvie, but she dropped her gun and caught it. She kneed me, which made me drop my gun and punched me back. I fell to the ground, but immediately flipped back on my feet. I wasn't going to give up. Once I got up, I kicked her in the stomach and punched her back onto the ground. "Holy shit," I heard my mom start to say quietly behind me, but I continued fighting, so I didn't hear the rest. She got back up and punched me onto the ground. I felt my jaw almost crack. I tried to stand up, but I was too weak now. I watched as Sylvie rubbed the blood away from her mouth and walked to my parents with her loaded gun. As a last resort to save my parents, I dived at Sylvie's legs when she fell to the ground. Before she fell, she sought the window, making it shatter and letting the cold wind start to fly inside. I watched as my parents fell out of the window. Sylvie stood up in rage and pointed her gun at me. "No!" I screamed as I ran toward the window to catch my parents. Sylvie started to shoot at me as I ran, but she missed. I dived out of the window into the cold air of Las Vegas. I watched as my parents flew further and further down the building. I dived faster and faster until I caught up to them. I saw a small cleaning panel on the side of the building and knew what I had to do. This may not hurt them, but it would definitely hurt me. "Hey!" I shouted over the wind to my parents. They both looked back at me. I held out my hands. "Grabbed onto me!" They did, and I moved over to the cleaning panel on the side of the building. I came too close to the building and started sliding down the side of the building with my legs. My legs burned, and my feet were on fire. I had never done this without a suit before, and now I realized that it really hurt. Although it cooked my feet alive, the friction against the wall was starting to slow us down barely, so I wouldn't completely fail trying to save them. I finally made it to the cleaning panel and took a deep breath in. I tightened my grip on my parents' hands and landed on the cleaning panel. I landed on one side of the panel and rolled to the other side almost immediately after I reached the ground. I screamed in pain because it felt that I had shattered my feet into 100 pieces and my ribs too. The spot where I had landed, I rolled, suddenly fell, unable to bear the weight of the force against it. The panel tilted downward. Thinking quickly, I ran up to the other side of the panel that had not fallen and swung my legs over the railings. Now, I was holding on vertically to both my parents above Las Vegas on the Bellagio with only my feet. I'm not sure how I was able to sustain the amount of power I had at the moment, but the power to keep my parents alive after all this time burned inside of me. If they died, everything would play out as it usually would. But if they lived, my entire life would be so different. I needed to save them. I adjusted my feet on the bar and flexed my face in pain. I bit down so hard on my teeth in pain to hold my strength that I started to feel my teeth sink into my gums and bleed. "Rye," my dad said. "Not now," I urged myself to say while trying to think of a way to get out of the situation we were all in. I was sweating so hard now. Being upside down almost made my head start to swell uncomfortably. "Rye," my mom said. I started, but the side I was on started to jerk downward. We all screamed in fear, but it eventually came over us. We didn't have much time. "Rye," my dad said again. "Dad," I said, but they finally continued. "Let us go," my mom said calmly. My feet almost slipped off the bars. "What?" I asked nervously. All my hope started to drain out of my body. "We know you're trying to save us," my dad said. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" my mom said. And you don't want to live through that again, my dad said. Both of them stared into my watery eyes. My eyes were watery from both of them telling me the news and the last of my strength exiting my body. So just let us go, my mom said. I'm not ready yet, I cried. I can't go on without you anymore. But you can, my dad encouraged me. You lived without us for such a long time now. You've become better than us. Stronger, my mom continued. My feet started to slip, but I forced them to hold on just a bit longer. You haven't lived your life yet, Rai. You're still just a kid. And even though you don't have your parents to watch you go on, my dad said, we'll always be with you. We've seen you in your hard times, even now, my mom continued. It felt that I was no longer talking to my parents at that time, but from the soul of my parents in the future. Will you be with me? I asked as I cried even harder. We will, my dad said. Always, my mom finished. I had already lost one person at this very same building before, so it just made it harder for me to lose two more important people in my life again. My feet started to slip even more. I love you guys, I said quietly as I cried the hardest I had since I heard my parents had died from that glum day on the swings with the cop. We love you too, they both said. Now, my mom said. Let's go, my dad finished. I knew I had to, but my mind had to be convinced. I thought of all the things that we couldn't do together, all the time we didn't have. I never had time. Let's go, my dad said. The memories we could have shared. Let's go, my mom said. The good times we could have experienced together. Rai, my mom said. I stepped away from my thoughts. Let's, my dad said. Go, my mom finished. I closed my eyes and slowly let them fall from my hands. I looked at them with eyes full of tears. I watched them look at each other and smile as they fell to the ground below. Right before they hit the ground, I looked away. I couldn't stand to watch it any longer. I looked up at the dark, starry sky. I closed my eyes and screamed in agony. I continued screaming, and I couldn't stop. Eventually, I lifted myself off the bar and lay on the bar. I cried and bawled as I heard ambulances drive to the bottom of the building. I realized it now. This had always happened. My parents had always been dropped by me. In every universe, I had come back and let them go. They may have wanted it, but I could have said no. I could have tried to lift them and protect them. I could have lived a happy childhood with them. I could have done all the things I could never do with anyone else. I could have saved them. I could have let my parents live and me die. But it was me. I decided to let them go and cut their adventurous lives short. I kept on trying to convince myself that it wasn't my fault because they wanted it, but I couldn't. I was too blinded by everything else in my life. Things would go back to normal when I would return, therefore making this all so much more painful. All my life, I've been fed two things: lies and questions with answers I have yet to find out. Some lies included Jamal knowing about my past, and me not crying when I buried my parents, or even the times when the mysterious figure who turned out to be Jamal told me that Oscar was alive, which he wasn't. Meanwhile, there are some questions with no answers, like why Jones told us, kids, to go into space. Why there was some cosmic butterfly in my dreams which gave me hope for a bright future, and many more. But there is one thing that fit both these categories. This very moment. At that moment, I felt like my life and purpose had been a lie this entire time, and the real question was, why was I even alive anymore? This time, I didn't just want to stay where I was and watch everything around me die and suffer. This time, I was going to end the cycle of suffering. I pledged to myself that I would kill Sylvie, even if it killed me. She had gone too far. She was gone. She was the original one that I had always known almost my entire life. And now, she was gone. I realized that my time was coming to an end, and that there wasn't much for me to do in my life. I was never supposed to live a regular life. My purpose was always to save humanity. I failed the first time, but I would not fail again. I felt the heat of light shine onto me. I looked up from the bar and saw a helicopter shining its lights down on me. They started to yell at me from the helicopter, but suddenly a small wide burst of energy shot from the building above me and hit the helicopter. I watched as some people fell out of it, definitely dead, but the helicopter was still flying. I noticed that the helicopter pilot was still driving, just dazed. Suddenly, the helicopter erupted in flames. I looked up. I could barely see the silhouette of a person's hand out of the building. It was Sylvie, controlling the helicopter. I saw her move her hand toward me. I watched as the helicopter started to move in my direction. Right before the helicopter hit me, I dropped down. I faced downward as I heard the fiery helicopter crash into the building. Suddenly, a web formed below me. I dived into it, determined, as glass shards passed me. I finally fell into the web with some glass from Las Vegas following me. Out of the void, pieces of my suit slowly started to speed toward me and cling onto me, reforming my armor. Once my suit fully reformed, I looked behind me. I saw Sylvie fall through the web and close it behind her. This time, I started to boost myself through the void I was falling in towards Sylvie. I sped up to her. She looked at me in surprise as I threw my fist at her. She got hit and started to spin away from me out of control. Quickly, she regained control of flying and looked around at me. Her suit suddenly formed, and she formed her helmet. She dived at me and tackled me in the air, both of us screaming in anger. I closed my eyes and heard the sound of glass shattering. Suddenly, I was flung away from her. We were back in NORAD. The good version of Sylvie was still above me, frightened. I looked at Sylvie. She unequipped her helmet and spat out blood. Some blood dripped down from her lip, but she wiped it away furiously. She clenched her fists as blood slowly started running down her forehead. I unequipped my helmet and looked at her. My heart tightened. Finally, after 5 years of pain, I was going to end this, once and for all. This episode was recorded by Tristan Kumar. If you enjoyed this, make sure to check out the final part in the Dying Planet trilogy. Part 30. It's going to be intense. This one was intense, holy cow. But anyway, if you enjoyed this, make sure you check out the next one. Thank you for listening.